Dr. Mike here, and today we're going to make traditional bone broth. Now this is something I recommend all my patients all the time because the nutrients that you get out of the connective tissue of, say, a chicken, turkey, things like that, as well as some of the material that makes up the bones and the bone marrow are of profound benefit to most people's health. I mean, not that long ago this would be a part of any healthy stock or soup, things like that. So again, it's something I recommend to a lot of people. I'm going to start off with a couple of raw chickens and just share with you the process that I do to prepare them so that the skin and the flesh or the meat of the chickens is delicious as well. Once the chickens are roasted up, we'll pull the flesh off and then we'll go through the process of looking at making the traditional broth itself. So the first step that I do is I take some really good sea salt and I just sprinkle it over the skin of the chickens before I even put them in the oven. Now, the benefit of doing this, besides adding a little bit more flavor, is that it draws a bit of the moisture or the water out of the skin of the chicken, especially where it's going to be the most exposed to heat. It's not quite as important at the bottom of the pan where the chicken is going to be sitting on the pan itself. Now, when the water gets pulled out of the skin, which you might see starting to glisten up here on the camera, is, again, as the water comes out of the skin, it makes the pores open up to allow the fluid outwards. And we're going to be covering the chickens up with a mixture of some butter, some thyme, and some garlic to coat them up before they actually start to really cook in the oven. Now the benefit again is once that water comes out, the pores open up. Once the butter goes on, everything seals up, and once it starts to heat up, the skin creates kind of a membrane or a layer that holds a lot more of the fluid and the juices inside the chicken. Now, because this is about our health, something I'd like to share is anytime you're roasting food, what you're really doing is cooking it through the evaporation of water. The piece of meat, the chicken, the fish heats up, and evaporation or water leaves the actual tissue of the animal that's in your oven. So the actual cooking process happens primarily at the temperature of steam. Now, as your chicken or your fish or your roast starts to heat up and the fluid leaves it, the risk is that all the fluid's going to leave very quickly and then dry it out, and then you have a much less enjoyable meal to share with your friends. So again, the idea here is sprinkle it with salt. I'm going to sit it in the oven at a low temperature to keep the skin warm enough so that as I spread the butter on it doesn't get congealed or hard. But I don't want the chickens to get too hot. I don't want the skin to seal up just yet. I just want it to be a little bit warm. And as they're sitting there in the oven being just a little bit warm, what I'm going to do is prepare the garlic and thyme butter that I'm going to put all over the chickens, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So to make the garlic thyme butter, what I'm going to do is take about a half a cup of butter and sit it in this bowl here, and I'm going to gently let this sit on the element of my stove while I'm preparing the garlic and the thyme. This is garlic I've grown in my garden and some thyme that I've also grown in my garden, and I've got some extra left over just in case I need some. So this is why I like the metal bowls, is I can actually sit these on the element of my stove and allow them to help me make sauces and things. So I'll put this on the stove right now. And as that butter is melting, I'm going to basically just chop up garlic and prepare a bunch of thyme, and then we'll add that to the butter when it's melted, and then we're going to spread that over the chicken. Now, most of us are familiar, if we like cooking shows or are a fan of cuisine, with the idea that when you're chopping up garlic, it's a good idea to squish it, and in fact that's actually very true. Now, you can squish it when it's still in the shape of a clove, or you can chop it up in smaller pieces and basically take the knife and just spread the pressure of the knife down on the garlic as you work your way across the garlic itself. Now, there's actually a fairly precise amount of pressure that you want to apply. You want to push down hard enough to break the structure of the garlic, and I like it in smaller pieces because I can be more precise this way. You want to press down on these pieces until the oil of the garlic is actually spreading out, and then as you release the pressure, the oils soak back into the garlic. Now that pressure actually changes the chemical structure of some of the oils in the garlic and makes them about 10 times more actually beneficial to our health. Now that's only true if the oils go back into the plant as quickly as possible so that they don't oxidize in the atmosphere. Now because I'm making a garlic thyme butter, I want as much of the flavor of the garlic to get into that butter as possible. So I want that oil to get squished out, but I don't want it to oxidize. Now if I was making a different kind of meal, I might want to save half the garlic for the end of the meal, because once you start heating up the garlic, of course some of those healthy elements of the garlic are going to oxidize or break down just because of temperature. So I have about 3 or 4 cloves of garlic per chicken. I have 2 chickens, so this might look like a lot of garlic, but it's probably just enough to infuse the butter and make a really, really flavorful coating for these chickens, because the skin is actually going to eventually be an element of the bone broth, and it adds a very, very nice roasted garlic flavor mixed in with the skin and the fat of the chicken. So, pretty yummy. So there's my garlic. The butter's just getting ready to go, so we're going to mix that together, then we're going to add the thyme, and then we're going to spread it over the chicken. Okay, so I've got my garlic chopped up with some fresh thyme from the garden in there, and I'm going to take some other dried thyme and add lots to it. I'm going to take that and add it to the butter. And then stir it up. And then give it a bit of time for the flavors to infuse. But I don't want the butter to cool down too much. And again, the chickens have been in the oven and they're just barely warm enough around room temperature so that hopefully the butter won't thicken up too much. And again, this might look like a lot of garlic, but the idea here is to prepare and flavor the skin so they can go into the bone broth as basically not only a nutrient element, but also as a big flavor element too. So we'll just get this going. And the important thing here is to try and coat as much of the skin as possible with the butter, just to protect it, and again to keep the evaporating fluids that are coming out of the flesh of the chicken from escaping too fast. We don't want to lose any of the healthy fats. Another important thing that we're going to be watching for is as the chickens start to really roast, and you'll start to see fat and juices coming out of the chicken falling to the bottom of the pan. What you're going to really want to do is make sure that you add some stock, maybe wine, other broth, mixtures of vinegars, things like that, into the bottom of the pan to keep the fats that are dripping off of the chicken from basically sitting there at a very high temperature up against the metal of the pan, because then you ruin part of the structure and the benefit of those fats. So basically usually about half an hour, 45 minutes, depending on your oven and how many chickens you're cooking. You're going to want to keep checking on the chickens and just make sure that as soon as it really looks like the fat is starting to release out of the chickens, you pour something into the roasting pan to make sure you don't ruin the fats. And I typically just use a bit of stock and some red wine and maybe even some water, just to make sure that everything tastes good and I don't lose any of the healthy benefits of what I'm putting into my body. So what I'm going to do is put these chickens in the roasting or in the oven and keep watching them for a while. And again, once it's time, I'll throw in the stock and we'll take it from there. So the chickens have been in the oven for about an hour, and what I'm going to do now is add about a cup of red wine across both of the chickens, and as well as around the bottom of the roasting pan. And the idea here is to, again, to keep the fats from being damaged by the temperature of the pan. I'm also going to add about a cup of stock. One of my favorite techniques when I'm roasting pretty much anything, be it a couple of chickens or a turkey, a duck, a good piece of elk or deer, grass-fed beef or bison, is a process called basting. So I want to, again, protect the fats that are melting off of what I'm roasting, because as they settle into the bottom of the pan, the danger is that those fats are going to get to a higher temperature than is good for the fats. So I mix in other things like wine and stock to protect them. So with basting, what I'm doing is picking up the fats, the wine, the stock, everything that's in the bottom of the roasting pan, and just pouring it over what I'm roasting. Pretty easy. Now the idea with this is to give lots more flavor because I keep picking up all of those healthy fats, all the spices that have fallen off, and keep pouring them over top of what I'm roasting. But more importantly, what I'm doing is creating a little bit of a seal on the surface of what I'm roasting. Now with a chicken or a turkey, because it has a skin, that seal is pretty easy to see and pretty easy to ensure. Whereas with other kinds of roasts, say a piece of bison or something, the process of basting is a little bit different. And it kind of relates to what's called braising, which happens with chickens and turkeys too. So what happens basically is as the oven is very hot, it dries out the surface of the chicken, the turkey, the roast, and that tightens up the proteins. So by basically basting what I'm roasting, I'm allowing that fluid to loosen up, soften up, and stretch out those proteins, and then they dry out again. Then I come back and baste it some more, and then I leave it in the oven and they dry out again. And this actually pre-digests or breaks down some of the proteins and connective tissue in either the roast or the skin of a chicken or a turkey. So, besides being quite kind of a gourmet fancy thing to do, and a nice way to ensure you have good flavor and very juicy finished roasts, there's actually a little bit of science behind why it's actually a very helpful way to improve your cooking, because it improves the digestibility of everything that you're cooking. So just another little technique to throw in there before we get into making our traditional bone broth. Enjoy. So here the chickens are after about 3 hours of being roasted and basted. I'm just going to cut the skin and see how they're doing. Should be done quite nicely all the way through. So the plan is to take off most of the flesh and use it for other meals for the next few days while we actually prepare the bone broth. So I'm just going to change the camera around and do a little bit of a close-up here, just so that you can see the level of doneness and hopefully how moist this is on the inside. So look at that. So you can see all the juice that's still in there. An important test for the doneness of chicken is that you don't see any blood, especially up close to the bone. So this chicken, I would say, in my experience, is pretty much perfectly done. So I'm just going to give this a little try, and it's perfect. So we can prepare the chicken, store it up, and then we can get to making our actual bone broth.